Okay, so while Ishan is doing that, so thank you, Ishan, for organizing this, Priya for getting the group together, and the rest of the panelists for being here, and the audience for listening. So my research, which is for a forthcoming book, which Ishan mentioned in his introduction of me, is set in 18th century Marwar. So Ishan, if you could go to the next slide. So, I mean, most of you, of course, would be familiar with the word Marwar, but the area outlined in red is where Marwar, the kingdom of the 18th century, and its contours as they were in the 18th century. This is what it looked like. I've also put up an image of the different parganas of Marwar with the capital at Jodhpur circled in red. So those who are students of history would, of course, be familiar that Marwar was among the Rajput kingdoms that accepted the suzerainty of the Mughal Empire and was integrated into the empire. But the Rajput kings were allowed to keep large parcels of this territory as their Watan Jagir. In the 18th century, with the collapse of the Mughal state, we have the Rathore kings of Marwar essentially becoming, in practice, full sovereigns of their territory. And that is the historical moment in which my research is set, and more particularly in the second half of the 18th century, by which point the Mughal state is even weaker. And the Marathas are active in terms of regular raids, etc., on this territory. So the next slide, please, Ishan. So these are the records on which my research is based. These are as the title says, the Jodhpur Sanat Parwana Bahis, which are annualized compilations of the orders and decrees of the Rathore crown sent to Pargana officers. And these were all transcribed in these central documents. These sources begin in the 1760s and trail into, in fact, the 19th century. But I found that the nature of the documents changes tremendously in the early 19th century, when they really thin out. And so that is where my research stops. So as you can see, these are a huge fat bahis. What I was very struck by is how little reference there was in these bahis to figures like the Bhangi, who also went by a caste that also went by the name Halal Khor or Jhadukas in 18th century Marwar, and also in other parts of North India. So this to me was remarkable, because and why was it remarkable was that other castes that were also stigmatized and low ranked in the caste order, such as leather workers, that would be who are known as Chamars, Meghwals, Bhambis in Marwar, they come up in quite a large number. But the Bhangis, Bhangis Halal Khors are truly very few. They also, so those are truly very few. So what I did was to compile the few references that there were to the Bhangis, and I just want to discuss those with you. So one of these is when it's a particular episode in which occurred in 1785, in which a Mahajan, which was a sort of a transcaste title given to merchants and money lenders, of a particular village in Parbatsar Pargana in Marwar, complained to the state that he had been punished for a crime that he didn't commit. So what had happened was that he was blamed for stealing grain by another merchant, and a village officer decided to punish him for this. And the punishment that was given to him was that he was tied up among Bhangis, and the Bhangis were ordered to spit on his face. And so he was so offended by this punishment, A, because of the nature of the punishment, and B, because he said he was innocent, that he went to the state in Jodhpur, the capital, to complain. And the state's decision in this case was that this was a punishment without judicial precedent. It was bedastur, and so it ordered that how could such a punishment have been ordered. Now, I know that actually this was not bedastur, because in a prior year, just 3 years before, in fact, in 1782, in a different pargana, somebody else had also been punished with being tied up in a public square and beaten with the shoes of Bhangis for 10 to 12 days. So the only difference was that in that case, the crown itself in Jodhpur had handed out this punishment rather than a provincial or a village level functionary. So that's this set of documents. And then there was a really remarkable one, which I believe it could be the next slide. Could you please change the slide? Yeah, this one, which I'll read out to you, the Marwari first, which is Apranch Uche Seher mein Sara ino keh deno, सुपोहर रात बाज्या पछे दोई घड़ी ताई श्री परमेश्वर रा नाव रोजीने लिया करे सो हिंदुवानु कहजो मैं तुरक ढेर चमार थोरी बावरी हलालखोर अछेप जात हुए जीणानु नहीं कहनो ने फिर चोंतरारा आदमी रोजीने शहर में फिर ने कया करे सुपोहर रात बाज्या पछे दोई घड़ी ताई सदा ही नाव लेवो करे श्री हजूर रो हुकम छे. Now, I don't know if any of you read the English while I was saying this, but in sum, what this document is saying is that about a quarter of an hour past sunset every evening, everyone in the towns of Merta and Nagaur should be told to recite the name of Shri Parameshwar, but that this should be relayed only to the Hindus, which is written as Hinduva, but not to the Achhe, which means literally untouchable, as in one who cannot be touched. These being Turaks, that's Muslims, Chamars, Dheds, two leatherworking castes, Thoris, Bavris, which are landless vagrant castes, and Halal Khors, which are the Bhangis that I mentioned earlier. And this is by the order of Shri Hajur, that is the crown. Men from the local administration should roam around the towns daily announcing this instruction. So this to me was, and I will say it's a remarkable document because I didn't find many others that clearly laid out like this. This is the meaning of Achhep. So we certainly find the Bhangi here, but we also find a range of other castes, which tells us that, I mean, this document tells us a lot of things, but one of those is that there was such a category called untouchable, literally translated as such in pre-colonial South Asia, and that this category existed also in law. It was activated and implemented through law, and not just in, you know, Brahminical discourse or bhakti poetry and things like that. The other thing that it tells us is that the meaning of this category was not clear, which is why the state had to say, but don't tell it to the Achhep, these people are the Achhep. Which then takes me to where my inquiry then went, which is that I found a range of other references that use the word Achhep, or literally untouchable, with reference to caste. One of these, and to me what was noteworthy in these is that the contours of Achhep were shifting. So sometimes there would be these remarkable ones in which we have, for example, the Mahajans of Pali, who got together in 1785. So it's actually around the same time that the guy was spat on by the Bhangis, but in a different province. So the Mahajans of Pali town got together and put an appeal to the state saying that the Brahmins, Mahajans, and other high castes, which they literally use the term Uttam Jat, have been drawing water from the same part of a particular of the town's tanks and wells as the rest, which are all Achhep castes, all untouchable castes. So here it's the Brahmins, Mahajans, and some undefined high castes versus the rest. When the order of the crown is quite interesting, which is that Agansu, Brahman, Mahajan, Vagere, Uttam Jat to eke ghat bharya kare, ne Achhep Jat duje ghat pani bharya kare. So the Brahmins, Mahajans, and other elite castes should draw water from one side, one ghat, and all the other Achhep Jats should draw water from another side. So here we have this sort of polarizing description. Separately, I had another one in which there is an order from the state vis-a-vis prisons, where in the Jalore town, the local kotwal objected to the fact that the governor had begun to house what he called untouchable castes with high castes, where again he listed Rajputs, Mahajans as the examples of high castes, and the exact sentence was Rajput, Mahajan vagere nu Achhep bhela kin tare rakhni ave. How can you house Rajputs, Mahajans, etc. with untouchables? So here again we have a very, very high caste versus everyone else. The next kind of gradation in this was to exclude artisanal castes and below. So this would be, for example, I have a reference in which some girls were found who were clearly being trafficked for sale. So they were without any kin, their origins were unclear. So this band of girls happened to get intercepted by some functionaries of the state, and the response of the crown in Jodhpur was to say that all the girls from this group who were not of such castes as carpenter, blacksmith, goldsmith, barber, and Muslim, or of any other untouchable or Achhep caste were then to be sent to Jodhpur. So here we have a kind of a loose definition again of achhep, which includes artisanal castes and Muslims, like again one of the earlier references I had mentioned. And it's, of course, the one interesting thing here is that quite often as historians have shown, slavery was a type of social death, and part of that social death was the erasure of the prior caste identity of the slave in question. So here it's interesting that there remains an investment in what was the caste origin of a female slave before she is integrated into a domestic establishment. So that's again where artisanals were excluded is one set of categories, and then the next gradation in the way achhep was sometimes defined was when it excluded specifically leather workers. So with that, for example, I have a reference in which I'm trying to find it because it's all mixed up. But in which a leather worker, a bhambi, was for some reason making ghee, and he came to sell this ghee to the state. And while selling the ghee, there was an ijaradar who had taken the contract of weighing the ghee and assessing the state's tax on it. But this ijaradar's employee took the ghee in the bhambi's own plate and stored it away for future sale. This became a point of contention where the state said, how could you take ghee in an achhep caste's bartan, vasan was the word, when other people might then unknowingly buy it. So in this case, there's a specific, calling out of leather workers here, bhambi, as being objectionable. And finally, another similar sort of cordoned off idea of the untouchable is a sort of landless vagrant castes like the Thoris, who generally lived out in the scrub, but also worked in villages in Marwar as landless laborers, as well as employees for jagirdars in a sort of military capacity. So there is an example in which a Mahajan approaches the state for help because his son-in-law, also a Mahajan, kicked the petitioner's daughter in the belly when she was pregnant, causing her pregnancy to terminate. And then as she was lying on her funeral pyre, he asked a Thori Swami, a renunciant, to cut open her belly. I'm not sure why he did this. Maybe he thought there could be another child in there. It's quite clearly said that the fetus came out before she died. So she lay on her pyre, he has her womb slit. So the father's concern was, of course, the fact that the daughter was killed, but he was also concerned, and the state in its reply says, why did you have to have the womb slit by an untouchable caste? And specifically, if I'm able to locate this, it says, achhep jaat karne pet kyun fadavno pade? And so for this, the person who did this was punished with a fine. So that's sort of the span in terms of caste, how this plays out, and the one thing I want to flag here is that this status of achhep, or being an untouchable, was not restricted in the 18th century state's imagination to those who we would today call Hindu. That is, as you've already noticed, we had the Turak come up as a person who was also untouchable. For example, in this being a very remarkable record in which that happens, the one that's on screen, but there was also another reference in which we have the state say that, and this is a longer story, but that Muslims and other low castes, or Musalman vagere neet jaat, should not be allowed to keep herds of goats or sheep. So here again, there's a clubbing of a Musalman with neat jaat, as there was with the slave girl question, where again, Musalmans were listed as examples of explicitly untouchable castes. So, tying together all of these references, well, what do we take away from this? So the first is that I think there is more to say about the history of untouchability in pre-colonial South Asia than has already been said. There has been very important work done on, Dharmashastrik law, Brahmanical law. There has been important work also done from the Bhakti perspective in terms of the poetry composed in the voice of the untouchable. But it is, well, so those kinds of references can often be indicative or give us a sense of the discourse of untouchability, or the literary or the legal imagination of untouchability. But the argument can be made that we do not know how and to what extent it was actually practiced. The one area from which we do have some insight about that is the Peshwa state in modern-day Maharashtra. where again scholars have shown the implementation of a polarized caste order of untouchability, though I'm not sure if it is using a name like Achep, which literally translates to untouchable. But there, in that case, it has been possible to explain that by saying, well, this is a Brahmin-led state, so it is trying to implement a Brahminical idea of society. So I think these materials from Marwar point to something else that is going on outside of the Maratha kingdom that I suggest is part of perhaps a turn in certain post-Mughal polities that are ruled by what we would today call Hindu kings. And this is also reflected in other outputs by those courts, which often use terms like Hindu in opposition to Musalman or Turak, often in pretty strident terms. But that could still be explained, using the kind of explanations that Cynthia Talbot has convincingly shown, which is that at times of stress, at times of political conflict, we often have a heightening of this oppositional discourse. And also that discourse is very Hindu versus Turak or Hindu versus Musalman. But I think paying attention to the types of sources that I have, which are not about courtly production, but are about the administration of society, it suggests that the category Hindu, which again the source that is up, it explicitly uses the term Hindu and tries to define what is Hindu, was fleshed out, understood, administered, imagined in terms of caste, so that it is possible to place the Muslim as an untouchable, and it is also possible to imagine the Hindu as a group of elite castes. So and in that sense, the suggestion that I'm also trying to make is that in the pre-colonial past, Hindu, first of all, clearly existed as a term, but that it was not what perhaps a simple reading or a imposition of modern categories. It was not simply a sort of a religious category, but much more so it was a caste category, and that processes in the 18th century intensified the redefinition of Hindu in these caste terms, leading to a greater polarization and a stigmatization of low castes as well as Muslims. And in this is where the Bhangi comes back in. The Bhangi became the very embodiment of that which was most feared, that is the status of the untouchable and the bodily being of an untouchable. And it is the Bhangi who was in these shifting contours of what it meant to be untouchable, the figure that was most undebatably not whose status was not debatable was the Bhangi. And the daily marginalization as well as this sort of weaponization of the Bhangi's body only underscored for everyone else what it meant to be and symbolized what it meant to be untouchable. So that's roughly my argument vis-a-vis caste, and this fits into my larger argument in which I show that these types of polarizations, segregations played out on a range of sites, which included residential space, it included temple communities, and this is where I think it connects or maybe speaks to some of the stuff that Purnima was saying. Played out in particularly Vaishnav Bhakti communities centered on the worship of Krishna, like the Vallabh Sampradaya. It played out also in terms of new ethical approaches that were implemented through law, such as the drive to protect animal lives, which is a fascinating chapter in the history of 18th century Marwar, where animal slaughter was banned, and that ban was actually implemented, as well as a drive to impose chastity on the aspirant elites, which brings me to some of the points that Abhishek raised, and I think Purnam also talked about, which is the role of mercantile castes, Mahajans, who, as you can see, were quite an active presence in the records that I just mentioned, where I suggest that the 18th century, and this is where the historical context, apart from the post-Mughal issue, becomes important, that the 18th century sees merchants capitalize on longer-term processes that have played out in the centuries prior, where they dominate the state in Rajasthan, and which is why I think it's important to also say, what are we talking about when we're talking about this state? Well, here it's merchants, moneylenders, and that they are also becoming dominant in the economy. As we know, when we hear Marwar, we think of the Marwadis, and that process is actually unfolding parallelly in the 18th century, that Marwadis have fanned out and are dominating money flows across the subcontinent, and that is having an effect also on the social order in Marwar. So I suggest that many of these polarizations are being driven by Marwaris. So I had a few other slides, but I don't have to show them. And so that is the sort of the larger picture into which the particular materials I shared with you today fits. Thank you.